As Big as a Kite, a Christmas story by Fred C. Rowley. A billion years ago, it was no larger than a schoolboy's snowball as it drifted aimlessly through the Oort cloud, trillions of miles from the sun. From time to time, it collided with another snowball of similar size and composition and grew a little larger. It continued in this manner in the vast void of space for millions and millions of years until it had grown to be twice the size of Manhattan Island. A final thump from an ice chunk just smaller than Mount Rushmore nudged its direction slightly, and it began, ever so slowly, to fall toward the sun on a journey that would consume 37,000 years. Now, as the sun rays began to warm its surface, ice crystals loosened and were carried by the solar wind into the vast emptiness. A small tail began to trail. One dark night in the cold Arizona air, its reflected light registered for the first time in the retina of a human eye, the eye of Taylor Fife. As a young man, Taylor Fife was a bully, and he was good at it. One of the best, in fact. And he was bitter. Boy, was he bitter. Bitter as a bad batch of Brussels sprouts. And he had plenty of resources to draw upon to fuel his anger. His parents, well, for the sake of brevity, let's just say they weren't around. Through his life, he had been in and out of 11 foster homes. Some had treated him well, but others had been unusually unkind. But he was smart. You better believe he was smart, but the bitter covered it up and hampered how much useful knowledge actually entered his mind. The kid was new and didn't know that you didn't lip off to Taylor Fife. And that day was a particularly bad day to smart off because Taylor happened to be in a particularly bad mood. Taylor was giving him a solid beating, and at the very moment he let fly with the strongest punch, he was shocked to suddenly see the face of Velma Nelson, his high school English teacher, appear just in front of the new kid's nose. Whap! His fist connected just below her right eye. Of course, that instantly ended the fight, and Mrs. Nelson had him in a firm lock, escorting him to Principal Fenton Clough's office. The flesh around her eye was already swelling rapidly and taking on a broad spectrum of dark colors. The eye was all Mr. Clough needed to see. Taylor, I believe I have at least a little bit of understanding and sympathy for your unfortunate lot in life, and because of that, I may have been too easy on you and let your past offenses slide in hopes you'd do better. Mrs. Nelson here, as he pointed to the teacher, and Velma, I hope you'll pardon me for saying this, is at an age where that punch could have been fatal. I'm sending her to the emergency room now to make sure there's no permanent damage. And as for you, I'm expelling you immediately. I'll notify your foster parents at their work as soon as I escort you off this campus for good. We've all had enough. With that, he arranged for an aide to drive Mrs. Nelson to the hospital and then escorted Taylor to his hall locker. He handed Taylor a milk cart he'd grabbed from the lunchroom dock and had him fill it with all his belongings. He marched him outside to his new 1974 Mazda, the one with the rotary engine, and drove him to the house where Taylor lived with his foster parents. No need to bring me here, Taylor mumbled. Today's my 18th birthday. They told me this morning they were done with me too. Principal Clough placed both hands on the top of his steering wheel, hung his head and sighed. I'm sorry, son. I'm very sorry, but it's just the way it has to be. Taylor got out and dumped his belongings from the milk crate onto the lawn and then tossed it back in the car. There's your crate. Wouldn't want you to turn it into a criminal too. He slammed the car door hard and leaned up through the open window. And don't call me son. I'm nobody's son. He left his belongings on the grass and stormed into the house. It was dark inside. His foster parents wouldn't be home for hours. He dropped onto the couch and curled into a ball and sobbed himself to sleep. Shortly after 3:30 that afternoon, he was awakened by the doorbell ringing. He didn't answer. Then a knock. He laid still, Then a more insistent knock. He didn't move. Finally, a bit of rustling on the latch, and then the door creaked open a bit. "Taylor?" The door opened all the way, and bright sunlight poured into the room. There, silhouetted in the frame, stood Mrs. Nelson. "There you are," she said. She stepped into the room and flipped on a light. Now Taylor could see the dark bruise had spread across the entire side of her face. Her right eyelid was swollen completely shut. She held a cardboard box and had a guitar case slung over her shoulder. She walked to the couch, laid her burdens on the coffee table, and sat down next to Taylor. "Mr. Clough told me that today is your 18th birthday. Well, happy birthday." She reached into the box on the table and removed a carton of ding-dongs. She handed them to him and said, "It's not much, but it's the best I could do on short notice." She turned to face him more directly and folded her hands into her lap. "Now, as to your being expelled halfway through your senior year, that's a problem, but we're going to fix it." "What makes you think I want to fix it?" Taylor said. "That's neither here nor there," she said. "We're going to fix it because it needs to be fixed. Your grades are not all that good. It's not because you're not smart. You're one of the brightest students I've ever had in all my years. It's just that your behavior has prevented you from learning the things that you need to learn. Here in this box I have a math book and an English book. Both are self-study. You're going to study them, then you're going to pass this GED, then you're going to enroll at Pima Community College here in Tucson." "But," Taylor said. Mrs. Nelson went on, "They don't care as much about grades as they do at the University of Arizona, and the credits are cheap. You'll do well enough that after a couple of years you can translate those credits to U of A, and then you'll get a bachelor's degree on a scholarship." "But," Taylor tried again. She continued without a pause, "My nephew Ralph has a fuel depot in the middle of nowhere out by Casas Adobes. He needs a night watchman. The place has a little studio apartment with a bed, a bathroom, a microwave, and a fridge. You'll live out there where you can study in peace and won't have anyone to fight with. My husband died 6 years ago. I've hardly ever used his old Ford pickup ever since that day, so I'm going to loan it to you to get to class and back. I'll only need it occasionally to haul away branches and things, and you can help me with that." "But why are you doing this?" Taylor finally jammed the question in. Mrs. Nelson paused and took a breath. She looked him directly in the eyes with the one good eye she had. "Because, Taylor, you are too valuable for us to lose. And don't you ever forget that." He hung his head and rubbed his face to hide the tears that had come into his eyes. "Will you do it?" she asked. Yes, I will," he replied. "Thank you. And I'm sorry about what I did to your eye." He could say no more. "Just a couple of more things then," she said. "Jim, my husband, loved music and astronomy. He said they were the perfect fit for each other. You'll be out there in the dark. They don't build some of the world's largest telescopes here in the Arizona desert for nothing, you know. In this box there is astronomy books. You can study the heavens all night long if you choose. And this is his old guitar. It was never a fancy one to begin with, and it's a little beat up, but you can learn to play songs on it." She unzipped the case and showed it to him. It wasn't as beat up as Willie Nelson's, but it was close. "And finally, this is for me personally. It's a new Bible. I want you to read a little bit in it every day. Start with the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 8. Then I'd ask you to skip over to the book of James. James was the brother of Jesus. He seems to have had a lot of practical advice for how to live a good life. Most people don't lose their jobs because they don't know how to do the work. They lose them because they can't get along with their fellow workers. James will help you improve in that area, I think." With that, she gave him a quick pat on the shoulder and left. When he was alone, Taylor packed his suitcase. He put a do not disturb sign on his door and went to bed. When his foster parents came home, they were relieved to see the sign and left him alone. Very early the next morning, he made himself a few peanut butter sandwiches. Then he took all his belongings tucked them behind the barbecue in the backyard. Then he walked to the city library and waited until Mrs. Nelson's teaching day was over. She arrived about 3:30, and they retrieved the things from the backyard. She drove him to her house and handed him the keys to the pickup. He followed her out to the fuel depot, where she introduced him to her nephew Ralph and left them. Ralph walked him around the property, showed him his new apartment, and left him alone. Taylor breathed deeply. A huge load had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, his first night ever alone, he felt completely free. After he ate his last sandwich and a couple of his birthday ding-dongs in his tiny kitchen, he opened the Bible as he had promised and began reading the Sermon on the Mount. Several verses had a deep impact on his mind. Quote, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. Ye have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor, and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." And then from the book of James, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world." After reading late into the night, he still couldn't sleep. He stepped outside, and the immense star-spangled sky made him take a sharp breath. Billions of stars lay before him, and he immediately fell in love. As the days passed, the study of comets intrigued him. The quest to be the first person to detect one captivated his imagination. Almost every night for 4 years, he would spend at least 3 hours studying the stars in search of a comet. He learned the first night to ignore the dozens of airliners crisscrossing the sky with their blinking lights. Later, the moving satellites began to be easy to spot. He soon identified the planets as they majestically arced across the sky in their eternal order. Eventually, he knew the sky so well that he could tell when something out of the ordinary entered the scene. He was able to spot 2 different comets on his own through the years, but those with bigger telescopes had always detected them before he was able to. While he was working on his degree, Mrs. Nelson retired and moved to Kansas. They exchanged letters for years, but time moved on and the letters stopped coming. He continued his studies and earned a degree in medical engineering. On the day he got his bachelor's degree, the giant comet was 3 billion miles from the sun and had just passed Pluto. He met and married Grace, and they had a son. Because he had developed several improvements in medical equipment, he was making a comfortable living, so he bought a bigger telescope and continued to monitor the sky as a way of relaxing. In 1988, the big news was that a supernova had exploded and all the world's telescopes turned toward it to record the celestial fireworks. That night, after taking his own photos of the supernova, and while all the world's telescopes were preoccupied with it, he turned his telescope to the opposite side of the sky and began to scan for anything unusual. He moved slowly across, naming the major stars by heart as he moved past them in a grid-like manner. Then, an unexpected blip of light. He froze, inched back. He took a sharp breath in the brisk winter air. This was something new. Could it be? It had to be. It was an unreported comet. He checked again after a bit of time passed. It had moved. He noted the coordinates on a small pad of paper and rushed to the phone. His fingers were shaking as he dialed the number. The rotary dial seemed to be spinning extra slowly just to torment him. A click, then a voice. "International Astronomical Union, how may I help you?" "Hello, my name is Taylor Fife. I'd like to report the sighting of a new comet." The new comet was officially named Comet 1988 D5 Fife. One night in early August, as Taylor viewed his comet as it approached the sun, an idea formed in his mind. 2 days later, he decided to act on it. Then in September, over dinner, he casually mentioned to Grace that they had an appointment at the courthouse in the morning. "Why, are you back to your old line of delinquency?" she asked. He laughed and then explained his plan, and to his relief, she agreed to go along with it. That December, the comet quickly became the biggest news story around the world. It would make its closest approach to Earth on Christmas Eve. It had a coma, or a tail, larger than any that had ever been seen since photography had been invented. It was bright enough to be seen during daylight hours, and at night it shed its glorious light across the entire sky. A few days before Christmas, he received a letter that shocked him. The return address said it was from Velma Nelson at Sunset Rest in Tucson. He thought she had died in Kansas years ago. She had to be coming very close to being 100 years old. Dear Taylor, someone is writing this for me. I fear my beautiful handwriting has gone the way of the world with all my shaking. Congratulations, there are few things in this life that have the potential to grant a person's name a greater portion of immortality than having a comet named after them. For example, Edmund Halley described his comet over 350 years ago. I am so pleased for you. You may not know this, but until 6 months ago, I was living with my daughter Marguerite in Kansas. I have outlived both her and her husband, so I decided to relocate back to Arizona. If you ever have the chance, I would love to see you. I'm staying at Sunset Rest in Tucson. Sincerely, Velma Nelson. On Christmas Eve, the sun had set at 5:30, and by 6 o'clock, the comet was in fine form in the crisp, clear Arizona atmosphere. Taylor and Grace were at the observatory on Mount Lemmon that evening. They were the guests of honor at a reception held as early in the evening as possible so everyone could get home to their family festivities. Television crews from around the world were there to record the reception and the closest approach of the Christmas comet. Taylor and Grace shook hands with everyone and posed for photo after photo with each of the astronomers that were there. The comet made a brilliant backdrop behind them. After an hour, the reception drew to a close. Taylor and Grace began their descent from Mount Lemmon. They had no family obligations because their son was serving in the Navy on a submarine somewhere between South Korea and Hawaii. At the base of the mountain, they drove to the west side of Tucson to the Sunset Rest Care Center. Taylor pulled his old guitar from the back seat. They entered the facility and were directed to Velma Nelson's room. She was sitting in a chair watching the television and eating some Christmas treats. Taylor knocked softly and said, "Mrs. Nelson?" She looked up and gave a quick laugh. "It's you," she said. "I was just watching you on TV. I'm so happy to see you. What are you doing here on your big night?" He answered, "It's because someone once told me to read the book of James, and James says to visit the fatherless and widows in their need. I was fatherless and you visited me, so now we're here to visit you." He stepped forward and gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead. "You look like you've got enough food and shelter, so I'm just here to sing you a song that may be more fitting tonight than any night since it was written." He pulled a battered old guitar from the case. "Do you remember this old guitar you gave me that dark, dark afternoon so many years ago?" "Yes, I do," she said. Her eyes were sparkling. He plucked each string to put it into tune. Then he strummed it a couple of times and began. Said the night wind to the little lamb, "Do you see what I see? Way up in the sky, little lamb, do you see what I see? A star, dancing in the night, with the tail as big as a kite, with the tail as big as a kite." Grace and Mrs. Nelson, with their wispy voice, joined him for the next verse. Said the king to the people everywhere, "Listen to what I say. Pray for peace everywhere. Listen to what I say. Pray for peace everywhere. The child, sleeping in the night, he will bring us goodness and light. He will bring us goodness and light." Mrs. Nelson clapped her hands. Oh, that was just beautiful. You've learned your guitar so well. Thank you, thank you. What a perfect song to sing about your comet. Taylor leaned the guitar on the couch and suddenly grew somber. Well, now that you mention it, Mrs. Nelson, there's something I need to say. You know, you're really the only family I've ever had. You literally saved my life. I owe everything to you. I've done something I hope you won't mind. It's all explained here. He pulled an envelope from inside his jacket pocket. This just recently came in the mail. It's a letter from the International Astronomical Union. They're the ones that name the comets. I want to read it to you. He began. Dear Mr. Fife, as we had corresponded previously, it is our policy to only name comets after those who have made the discovery, with no other additional names permitted. But in accordance with your most recent request, along with the documentation of your court-approved name change, we are pleased to inform you that the comet formerly known as Comet 1988 D5 Fife will now be designated Comet 1988 D5 Nelson Fife. Once again, we congratulate you on the discovery of this most wonderful celestial object. Sincerely, Cecil B. Merriweather, General Secretary. Velma Nelson was unable to speak as tears brimmed her eyes. Taylor and Grace both sat silently for a few sacred moments. Then Taylor leaned forward and slapped his legs. He stood and went to Velma's chair. He took one of her arms and Grace took the other. He said, "Now let's go out and see our comet. It is magnificent."